Introduce Phil Goldberg. Sarah gave me a cheat sheet, and I'm going to tell you a couple other quick things. Phil Goldberg is the author or co-author of numerous books, a public speaker and workshop leader, a spiritual counselor, meditation teacher, and ordained interfaith minister. A Los Angeles resident, he co-hosts the Spirit Matters podcast, leads American Veda tours, and blogs regularly on Elephant Journal and spirituality and health. His new book, The Life of Yogananda, the story of the yogi who became the first modern guru, is a comprehensive biography of the master teacher, Paramahansa Yogananda. And I'll just say, from my personal experience, I've seen Phil give a great Beatles presentation, if anyone has seen that. I've seen Phil do that. And also, Phil, I didn't tell you this, but I actually cited this book in a forthcoming chapter about Yogananda's music. You say some great things about the lack of work in that area, and so I was like, I'm going to write a chapter about that. But this is a great book. Chris Chappell has shared it with me, so if you don't have a copy, pick one up before you go here. And American Veda, the other book, which I'm glad you brought too, we actually use in the modern yoga class. So if you're thinking about the program, get it now, and we'll use it.
At the LMU discount.
At the LMU discount.
Oh.
So Phil, I'll let you take it away. Welcome, and thank you for coming. Yeah, I'll tell you after, yeah.
Hi everybody, happy Diwali. Happy post-election. Thank you all for coming. How many of you are in the Yoga Studies program? And others are visitors, curiosity seekers, faculty members, spies. How many of you have read Autobiography of a Yogi? Wow. How many have been meaning to read it? I read it for the first time in 1970. Yes, I was a child prodigy. It was at the very beginning of my spiritual path. I was reading everything I could get my hands on about Indian philosophy and Eastern philosophy in general, at the expense of my graduate school education. And that book had a big impact on my life. It was, as you know, I had read a lot, but here was a story of a genuine yogi, a real Indian holy man, and it opened me up to wanting to go to India, and taught me other things. At that time, I was living in Cambridge, Mass., and that book was circulating among my cohort of seekers and counterculture crazies. And I still have that copy all these years later. I should have brought it. It's a hardcover, and it says on the cover, $5. I know that sounds cheap, but $5 in 1970 was more than I could have spent. So I probably borrowed it and never returned it. And I still have it. And I have moved 15 times since then, twice cross country, and I still have that same copy. So it must have had meaning for me. I have now written a biography of Yogananda to make up for the karma of ripping off. I am now absolved. I am free. But I will explain why I wrote that book, because I get the question ever since I took on the project and mentioned it to people. People have said, why write a biography of somebody who is known worldwide for his own autobiography?
Good question.
That question may have occurred to you. So here, there are serious reasons for it other than working off the karma of ripping off a book. One is, when I was working on American Veda, do you all know about that book? Some of you have read it for school. So that covers more than 200 years of history of how all these teachings came here from India and all the people who were responsible for the transmission of these Vedic ideas and yogic teachings into the heart of American culture. So while I was researching that, I came to appreciate Yogananda's role in that story, which was huge. He was a magnificent figure in the narrative of that 200 years. Very important figure, especially given the time period that he was here. He was the first of the yogis and swamis to settle in America, and he lived here for most of his life, and almost all of his adult life. And that was terribly important. He was here from 1920 till his death in 1952, with the exception of a year in India, and had a huge impact. So that was one reason. And when I wrote about him in American Veda, I just didn't have the space to do it justice, so I thought. But the other reason was, I came to realize that his human story, the story of how that boy born in 1893 in Bengal, actually he wasn't born in Bengal, but to Bengali parents, grew into this world teacher. And the challenges and trials and tribulations that he went through that are rarely talked about, all that human story gripped me, and I realized as a storyteller, there's a great story to be told here that's not told. There's missing stuff. And then finally I realized there's a great story to be told, but didn't he tell it in his autobiography? So I reread it, and no, he didn't. He left out a lot. Less than 10% of the autobiography of a yogi is about his life after he comes to America. And a great deal of that book, as great as it is about other people, not his own life story. And much of what he leaves out is what makes his story really interesting. So I set out, for example, he arrived in 1920, as you'll see, in Boston. In his autobiography, there's one or two sentences that read something like, and 4 years passed in Boston. And I thought, well, he arrives in 1920, he hits the road in 1924. What happened in between? It must have been really interesting. So it was to fill those gaps and to tell the story of some of the challenges he faced, the human challenges, the lawsuits, the betrayals, the trials. That's why I wrote the book. And that's why I think it's a story well worth telling, because it's a story not just about a great teacher, but of somebody who comes to a new culture and brings with him wisdom from of the ages, old wisdom from India, into modern American life in a very interesting period of American history, the 20s, the Great Depression, the war, and how he did that, and what he endured, how he adapted. All that, I think, is very useful information, especially for people who hold these teachings of yoga to be of importance and who are, as those of you in this program will be, and already are, part of the story. You are part of what I wrote about in American Veda. You are part of the next chapter in these teachings being assimilated into American culture, an American way of life. This program is part of it. It would be in that book if it had existed when I wrote the book. Would somebody volunteer to get me some water? Thank you, Joe. So I thought we would begin with an overview of Yogananda's life. Is that okay?
Yeah.
With slides. Thank you, sir. And then we'll talk about some of the significance of it all, and I want to have plenty of time for conversation with you all. And maybe, Sarah, you could signal me if it's going too long, because I just wrote a 300-page book, and I have to, be economical with my time. So, Yogananda was born, as I said, in 1893 in the town of Gorakhpur in northern India. That alone is significant and worth talking about, where we spent those early years, but we'll skip it. This is his parents. You may have seen some of these pictures in his books or other sources, but from all indications, he had wonderful parents. His father was a kind of raised in poverty and became a self-made, successful man, an accountant by trade who worked in the railway system run by the Brits. Mind you, all this is part-time of the British Empire, and that's an important feature in Yogananda's life, living under the thumb of colonialism. So that factors into the story in an important way. And his mother came from a wealthy family, but the families that they created together with their 8 children, Yogananda was the 4th, was sort of upper middle class by Indian standards, relatively affluent, because the father had a position of some importance in the railway system. And they moved around a lot. This is Yogananda at age 6. The pictures on my book, that's one of them. This is the first known picture of him. And the picture on the bottom is the last picture ever taken. When he was 11, I think so, no, 13, they moved to Calcutta, what was then called Calcutta. How many have been to Calcutta? How many have been to this house? Oh, very good. This didn't exist when Yogananda lived there as a teenager. They added the upper floor. I was just there last month. I take tours to India, and we visited the house. They moved there 2 years after Yogananda's mother died. And one of the things I think that makes his life, if you read stories about swamis and yogis and Indian holy men, you don't always know much about their personal lives, especially their pre-swami lives. We know a lot about Yogananda, and that's one of the reasons his story is so compelling, because we know from him and his family how much of an impact the death of his mother had on him. Not just psychologically, losing a mother who he loved at age 11, but he wrote that the loss of his mother was instrumental in his being drawn to the feminine aspect of the divine, to the Divine Mother. And that became a big part of his devotional life. In any event, the family then moved to Calcutta, where they still are. His younger brother's grandson and his wife live in that house now, and they keep a couple of rooms as sort of shrines to their famous relative, and devotees and pilgrims are allowed to come and visit. And this is a picture I took of the room. Those of you who were there, were you in that room? Yeah. This is a meditation room. It's a tiny little space that when they moved in, Yogananda was, well, at that time his name was Mukunda Lal Ghosh, before he became Yogananda. Mukunda was a kind of spiritual prodigy. He was drawn to the spirit, to the life of the spirit as a boy at a ridiculous age. And when the family moved, he would find a place for his own sadhana, his own spiritual practice. He would have a little altar, he would have a space to meditate as a young kid. And so this room, which was then sort of a storage place or something on the roof, was his place. And now it's maintained, of course, with a picture of him and the guru lineage, and people come and sit and meditate in it, as my group did. This is him at 16. You can see the intensity. The eyes that people talk about, drawing them to autobiography, the yogi on the cover, you could, the eyes were part of his persona, even as a young, thin yogi at age 16. This is him with his older brother, who a few years later would die at a tragically young age. And the older brother and the father, because the mother was gone, were very worried about the adolescent Mukunda, because he didn't care about school. He didn't care very much for the usual pursuits of adolescence. He was single-minded in his devotion to his spiritual life and to finding the guru he knew he was destined to find, and to the life of renunciation. He knew this, you know the term dharma? I mean, yeah? So his swadharma was kind of intuited at an extremely early age. And not long after his mother died, when he was 11, was the first time he left home to go. You know, in America, when kids leave home, they like hitchhike to New York or Hollywood, or, he boarded a train for the Himalayas. He wanted to go up to the mountains where the yogis and dwell in caves and sit and meditate and commune with God. He was drawn to that even at that age. And the older brother and the father were worried that, you know, he would do something crazy and never return, or, you know, die of something, you know, up in the mountains. And so they always, the brother would follow him, post emergency notices. There's all this drama about how he ran away and never got to the Himalayas. And he tried this 2 or 3 times in the coming years. And the one time he actually wrote about was when they were living in the house I just showed you in Calcutta. And that room I showed you is where he threw his suitcase out of the window, and you know, you could see all that. You could sort of trace his footsteps and all. So that's what he was like. And when he was, you know, you've all been teenagers. In those years, adolescence, teen years, there's always people who are what we call ringleaders. You know, the sort of the ones who are like the people who initiate things. They throw parties, they organize teams, they get people together to, you know, do mischief or whatever is their thing. Yogananda was that guy, but he was organizing satsangs. He had his group of, he also organized foot races and soccer games, but that was a passing phase. He was very athletic, but he started organizing satsangs. He had this group, and he would go see every swami and every guru who came to that area, and he would learn things from them and pass them on to his group. His destiny to be a sponge of spiritual information and philosophy and yogic practices, and to pass them on, to be a teacher, he was marked for that at an early age. And he would have those gatherings in that little room, in other rooms of the house, and he actually started his first ashram when he was 15 in a little hut that his friend's father, just a short walk from that house, gave them, and that on that property is now a center in the Yogananda lineage. You can visit it if you go to Calcutta, especially if you have a connection. And then, of course, before I go into this, one thing that I think you would find very useful to look into and to learn about as students of yoga, history, yoga philosophy. You know, everybody is a product of nature and nurture. And when you write a life story, like I did, of a significant human being, you start to sort out, well, what were the characteristics he was born with that were just his at birth, whether through DNA or reincarnation or whatever you want to attribute it to, and what were the products of his environment, the family, the social and cultural and political period that he lived in, as I said, being part of the British Empire, Calcutta being the sort of center of the British Empire in India. And Calcutta, I got really, really fascinated by Calcutta in those early years of the 20th century. It's a fascinating part of the story and a fascinating part of what made Yogananda who he was. You all know the name Swami Vivekananda and Ramakrishna. Their legacy was a big part of what was going on in Calcutta at that time. And Yogananda would go up the river to the Kali temple where Ramakrishna had been and meditate there. And the activism of Vivekananda's lineage was part of the cultural milieu. So was the early days of the of the Indian independence movement. The most radical elements of the freedom movement were in Calcutta, including Sri Aurobindo as a young man who you heard someone lecture about fairly recently, I'm told. Sri Aurobindo, by the way, is a kind of distant cousin of Yogananda. It was the center of progressive thinking, politically, culturally, artistically, and Yogananda absorbed all that. It was also an area where the early days of physical culture movement and hatha yoga were popular, and that too had an impact on it. Anyway, after he finished high school, barely, and prevailed upon his father to let him go spend time in an ashram in Benares, what was then called Benares, now Varanasi. He one day met his guru, Sri Yukteswar. You've heard of him. And of course, Sri Yukteswar. The story of how they met and the story of Yogananda's time at that ashram, it's filled with mystery and wonder, as is much of his life. And I tried to replicate it as, and add details to it as best I could in the book. But it's a beautiful story, and the relationship between Sri Yukteswar and Yogananda, first Mukunda and then Yogananda, is very much worth studying because it's a fine example of the master-disciple relationship in that tradition, in the guru-disciple relationship tradition of India, and how that plays out, its rewards and its pitfalls, especially in the light of gurus coming here to America, where that kind of relationship is kind of not part of our DNA, and how it played out first with Yogananda as a disciple in the traditional way in India, and then how it played out with Yogananda as a guru with disciples who were American is very interesting and worthy of one of you doing a graduate paper. I do the non-academic attempt at studying these things. And of course, it turns out that Sri Yukteswar had been a disciple of Lahiri Mahasya, who, as it happens, was Yogananda's parents' guru as well, and Yogananda grew up with that picture of Lahiri Mahasya in his home, and there's a lot of mysterious and miraculous stories about that picture in his life. I neglected to pause the tape. Somewhere, here it is. I have to refer to my slide list. So, at one point, after spending, when he meets his guru, and he just wants to surrender to the guru, he has a little problem because he's very independent-minded. Disciples are not supposed to be independent-minded. They're supposed to do what the guru says. So there's a little moment there of great drama when Sri Yukteswar says, I don't think you could be my disciple. You're not doing what I told you, because what he told him to do was go back and finish college. He didn't want to. He had no use for that. But he did eventually, because he was told to. And those 4 years are very interesting to look at, because all he wanted to do was be at the Guru's ashram, which was upriver from Calcutta and his home. But he promised he'd finish school, and so he did the best he could, and through certain miraculous means, he does in fact pass his exams and has a degree. And the reason Sri Yukteswar told him he must get a degree was he knew he was destined to be the one to bring their Kriya Yoga tradition to America. He was to be an emissary to the New World, to the modern West. And he knew that if he had a college education, he would be taken more seriously. Probably also knew he'd master English that way and have a better understanding, since the Brits were running the schools, of Western philosophy and Western culture. And so after graduating and becoming a Swami, now he's Swami Yogananda, his mission, mind you, he was a renunciate. But as you probably know, in India, there are many different ways of being a renunciate. And some of them are solitary recluses who live in caves or wander the Ganges and eat what's given to them. Some live in ashrams. And some live in communal situations but are active in the world. And his destiny was to serve. And his guru made sure that he was oriented that way. He was to be a renunciate who would serve humanity. He had a passion for education and started a school, which eventually moved to the city of Ranchi, where it still is. Now it's more than a school, but the whole thing still exists and can be visited. Very worthwhile. And one day when he was in Ranchi, he felt the inner call. He had a vision that it was time to go to America. And what transpires then, when he goes to Calcutta to make it all happen, how he got on the first ship to go from India to America since before World War I. This is now 1920. How he got the money, how he got a passport in record time, how a berth on his first-class berth on the ship opened up. All these things happened through a series of remarkable events that I got a great kick out of writing about. And that I have no way of validating, but the stories that have come down are very worth reading about, and for me, writing about. In any event, he was off and running, and this is his passport photo. Notice anything remarkable about it? Anything?
Beard.
What stands out?
Western garb.
Beard.
Okay, turban. You're not used to seeing him with one. What else?
Beard.
He has a beard. All the pictures you've seen of Yogananda, after he comes to America, no beard. But there he is. And here he is in the Boston Globe the day after his ship arrived from India. You all, I can't tell you every story, but the trigger, he knew he was to come to America, and one of these miraculous events that happened was he somehow gets invited to speak at a conference in Boston. So he had an actual destination and people waiting for him, and the ship happened to be going to Boston in time for the conference and all that. So he arrives in Boston, and the Boston Globe would send reporters and photographers to the Boston Harbor to greet ships and take pictures of interesting people for the next day's edition. And here's Yogananda. And if you look closely, he's wearing his turban, he's wearing an Indian sort of tunic and Indian footwear, but no beard. Turns out that while he was on board ship, he not only gave a public talk, which convinced him he could do such a thing in English, because he was asked to talk to the passengers, but some Americans he met said, you know, it's 1920, you're a dark-skinned guy with long hair, you're wearing orange, you're going to stand out. And it's not always going to be friendly. So maybe you could do more to sort of fit in. So maybe lose the beard and the long hair. So he shaved, but he wouldn't cut his hair because that would have been too much of a violation of the Swami vow. Now I mention that because here's a picture of him with the other delegates at the Congress. As you can tell, he does stand out. And here he is later, wearing Western clothing and a hat and Western shoes, and his hair is pulled back. It looks like he has a regular haircut. I mention all this because it's one of the first things he did to adapt to America. Much of his adaptation is much more important. It's how he adapted the traditional teachings to American culture and American language and American style of doing things. That's the much more significant adaptation. But it started with fitting in. So he would shave, he was always clean shaven. And when he was out in public, when he was not teaching, he always taught in a robe or in a traditional Indian clothing, Swami clothing with his hair down. But when he was out in public, he would often wear a suit, he would often usually wear a scarf, a collarless shirt, and he would sweep his hair back and tuck it under his collar or pull it up under his hat. So he looked like, well, he could not change the color of his skin, obviously, or lose his accent. And he went through a lot because of that. It was a very racist time in America. Seeing people of Indian descent now in a place like Boston or LA or New York, no one would blink, obviously. But then he stood out, and it was a significant part of the story. Indian people could not become citizens until the 60s. This was still a period of what was called the Chinese Exclusion Act. Asians were not allowed to become citizens. There were very few Indians in America at the time. Most of them were students, or they married an American, or maybe they were a professor of some kind. Very few. And so he stood out. And unlike the teachers who came in the 60s and 70s, he was really one of very few people teaching what in those days would have been called Hinduism, or being a yogi, being a teacher of Vedanta or Indian philosophy. And he became very well known, so he stood out. And there was a lot he had to endure because of that. And so you can understand why he would want to be as inconspicuous as he could. there are a lot of interesting stories around that, but we'll spare you. This is, I'm going to show you a short video clip, silent, of him with some of his American devotees who were, ironically, given what we're talking about, are dressed in Indian garments to honor him in the streets of New York, 1931. He's in his mid to late 30s. There was an article in the New York papers the next day about these weird things. And in 1924, I'm not giving you all the details of his life in these years, but he started out giving some talks in people's living rooms in Boston. No one knew who he was. He met some people, they said, okay, I'll gather my friends, and that's how it all started. Then it became public lectures. Then the venues got bigger. Then he added courses that people paid for. And then there were devotees, and those devotees put up some money, and they learned how to advertise, and they rented buildings, and they started a chapter. And all this is how it all began. And before long, he was filling big auditoriums. And then in 1924, he decided it was time to take his act on the road, so to speak, and see America. And this is him and three of his students, two students and an assistant, in their Maxwell automobile going cross country. Mind you, this is long before the interstate highway. They were on small roads, going through parts of the country where even today looking like that would be weird.
But he booked tours. It was like it was all booked before he left.
What?
Were all these engagements booked before he left?
No. The first part of the tour was just getting there. The first talk was in Denver. This is him outside a billboard. Renowned lecturer, educator, psychologist from India, speaking on concentration and life force. This is Denver. One of those guys in the previous picture would go on ahead as the sort of advance man, set up lectures, rent halls, get publicity, and then they'd come. And the formula was, and this is, one of those adaptations, because, things like this weren't done in India. He would give a free talk, and they'd publicize it. People would come, and he'd give a full talk on philosophy or something. And then they'd have a series of classes where they would learn yogic methods and, more intricate teachings, and they would pay for that. And he would leave behind people who would then start a group, eventually a center and all that, and that's how it developed. So it was Denver, and then he went to Yosemite and through Montana and Yellowstone, not Yosemite, Yellowstone, Yosemite came later, and then it was Seattle and a side trip to Alaska and Portland and down the coast to the Bay Area, where he would do, in all the big cities, these courses and teachings. It was a long trip. And one of the interesting things about his personality, the human side of Yogananda, was he was a renunciate, but he really loved things about the world. He loved music. He loved movies. He loved sightseeing. And he wrote these flowery poems and songs about driving up to Pikes Peak in Colorado and taking the boat to Alaska and all this stuff. He fell in love with the American landscape. It was really beautiful. And, worked his way down the coast. Destination was LA, which he always knew would be the place. And here is, I think the whole thing took about 6 months, 7 months. And they arrived January 2nd, 1925 in LA, stayed at the Biltmore Hotel, and set up lectures. And this was an ad in the LA Times for the first lecture. Can you read it? It says, learn how to utilize the full forces of body, mind, and soul. Hear this inspired emissary sent by a Maharaja with a flaming message of soul-stirring power. They had learned advertising. Illustrious Hindu savant and seer, educator, psychologist, and metaphysician. Blah, blah, blah. Title, Mastering the Subconscious by Superconsciousness. This was part of the series. There were other titles. The Swami is sponsored in Los Angeles by a committee of foremost citizens. I actually found the names of some of those citizens and revealed them in the book. But this is the kind of thing he learned early on in Boston, that Americans are very practical people, and just speaking about philosophy, just speaking about higher consciousness or enlightenment may not get people in the door. But if you promise them practical results, better health, more success, more intelligence, more accomplishment, meeting your soulmate. It was the early days of what we come to think of as self-improvement, self-help, ethic of American life. And he learned to adapt the teachings in that way. And in that sense, he set the template for a lot of the gurus who came in the 60s and 70s, right up till today, who do the same thing. And in the yoga world, where you rarely will see an ad for a yoga studio or a yoga class that emphasizes higher consciousness. It's about health, it's about self-improvement, it's about that. That could be called selling out, or in some way diminishing the higher teachings of yoga. Or you could think of it as upaya, as skillful means of teaching people at the level they are able to take in, and then pointing them to the higher teachings. So right at the beginning, you see signs of, I always felt that Yogananda was a great example of a teacher of skillful means who was able to adapt the teachings to the people he was speaking to and what their needs and desires were, so he could interest them, so give them what they were looking for, but without distorting the teachings or corrupting them or losing sight of the fullness of what the yogic teachings represent. Am I making sense? And that to me is a standard that people who are transmitting these teachings to others should bear in mind. That kind of skillful teaching without losing sight of the bigger vision. So you give them something and let them know there's more. And he was very good at that right from the beginning, even when he was teaching the method of physical practice that he developed that was kind of similar to Hatha Yoga, but his own system. And he would talk about health and physical culture, but there was always pointing to the fact that it's about spirit and it's about higher consciousness. Making sense? So you see that, and I do that in my book. I say, well, you know, look at these lecture titles. Look at the titles of his courses. He's learning what appeals to Americans. And Americans are very practical people. These teachings caught on, as I write about in American Veda, because they had value. And they, you know, people were not, he didn't, like all the other gurus, he didn't say, you must believe what I'm telling you and have faith in my teachings. No, these are teachings. These are methods that come with techniques. Do them, see if they work. And they do. They have an impact, so people do.
It's also borrowing from Christianity, right, in a certain way, because, you know, preachers at the time, ministers, also use these techniques of offering these kinds of gatherings.
Well, that's a different subject, about which we might not agree. But some do. But it's much more faith-driven.
I was just wondering if he also was sensitive to all of that going on.
Oh, yes.
Boston, and picking
Absolutely.
up some of that in this poster. Yeah.
Well, let's hold off on that for a second, because, all right, I'll take it. Once he settled, how many of you have been to an SRF center or any group in Yogananda's lineage? How many have been on like a Sunday morning? It's like a church, isn't it? It's not like that in India. You don't have congregation and Sunday morning services at Hindu temples. This was an early adaptation. Vivekananda's lineage did it too, earlier. Oh, Americans get religious on Sunday morning. Let's have a Sunday morning service. Let's set it up so it looks like, if you go to the Lake Shrine or any of those places on a Sunday morning, you say, what is this, you know, Hindu Presbyterianism? What's going on? And it's set up that way. There's an altar, there's a podium, there's songs and prayers, but it's not Christianity. But he also, and that was a very interesting innovation. Sunday morning services. He also spoke about Jesus a lot. Enough so that there's like a 1,500-page volume called The Second Coming of Christ that his disciples put together from his talks and writings about Jesus. He spoke as much about Jesus, quoted the New Testament, more than the Bhagavad Gita maybe in his teaching career. And part of that, people have said, oh, he was just doing that because Americans are Christians. But it started earlier. His guru, Sri Yukteswar, was a New Testament scholar. And the place in India that his ashram was, where Yogananda went to his junior and senior year of college, Serampore, was a missionary centerpiece in India. And biblical studies were part of the British Empire thing, and many Indians got into it for two reasons. One, it would help them adapt, under the British rule, but it also, they got that Jesus was a great yogi, teaching great stuff, and with a possible connection to India, and in their interpretation of Jesus and the New Testament. Well, modern people, preachers would call it blasphemy. It's certainly not the customary interpretation. But that was part of what appealed to many Christians about Yogananda. They could get a different take on the Jesus they loved, but weren't getting.
It's fascinating.
Yeah. And
So
so
those cues.
anyway, that's Yeah, that's a big part of the whole thing. So now, later that year, 1925, he decides LA, he called it the Benares of America. He knew this was destined to be his spiritual headquarters and home. And they went looking for a place. How many have been up on Mount Washington to what's called the Mother Center? I know you have. You should go visit sometime. It's a beautiful location. They found it in 1925. It was an abandoned fancy resort hotel that had seen better days. And they got the property, how it happened, how they got the money, all that stuff is also part of the human story that I found so interesting. But here he is at the very first this is Easter Sunday in the spring of 1925. And they held their first services. Mind you, Easter. So that connection to... Let me add to that business about Christianity. He always said that his mission to America was not just to bring what he called the true teachings of yoga, the tradition of yoga, particularly his lineage's teachings, but the original teachings of Christ. He truly felt that was part of his mission, that was given to him by his lineage of gurus. And there's a lot of metaphysical stuff around that you'll have to read my book to learn about or get elsewhere. So this was the opening of what came to be called the Mother Center up on Mount Washington, which is still the center, the headquarters of the international network of centers and temples around the world. Even in India, they answer to the swamis, the monastics at the Mother Center. Now, hold on a second. One of the things that, one of the reasons I wrote this biography was there were adventures, trials and tribulations, challenges to be overcome that are rarely talked about in the Yogananda world. How many saw the movie Awake? My screen debut. Some of it was mentioned in Awake, and a lot of Yogananda devotees were shocked that, my God, his former colleague and best friend sued him, and it was a big deal, and it was in the newspapers. But what the movie doesn't tell you is that 10 years later it happened again with a different person, and that was an even bigger scandal and bigger turmoil. There were times in Yogananda's life in America when he really wanted to give it all up. And he wrote about it, you see it in his letters. People, his devotees thought, he's not coming back. He went off to Mexico to get away from things for a while. When he went to India in 1935, he thought, maybe I won't go back, and people knew that. It was hard. Fulfilling his mission was harder than you might think. Sometimes we think that these great masters, these people who live in higher consciousness, must have an easy life. They must be in bliss all the time. Well, maybe they are in bliss all the time, but it doesn't mean that the outer circumstances of their lives always go easily or go well. And many times, people like us get on a spiritual path, we become yogis, and our lives get better, and we're more centered, and things go more smoothly, and we think it'll just be like that for the rest of our days. All the problems, and then you find out, no, not necessarily. course, karma is karma, and human development is human development, and relationships are relationships, and human beings are not always pleasant, don't always behave the way you want. And you learn that, your job is to work on your inner life, and the outer stuff is still going to happen, and how you respond to it, and how you maintain your yogic inner life. That's, part of the job. And when you see it played out in the life of someone of Yogananda's stature, and unmistakable and undeniable elevation of consciousness, then you realize, yeah, you're still in the world, and the world is still unpredictable and a bit of a mess, and part of the challenge is to rise to the occasion as is presented. And you see that play out in his life. There were times when he would say, I just want to be a renunciate. I just want to go back and, be with the yogis on the Ganges, go live in the cave like I always wanted to, live in an ashram, be in my motherland. He missed India. Why am I dealing with all this? Lawsuits, money issues. Mind you, his teaching became very successful, and there were centers all over the country, but there were bills to be paid, and mouths to feed, and opposition to contend with. And then the Depression hit. And for those years of the Depression, when highly skilled business people were going bankrupt and committing suicide and becoming destitute, here was this monk running an organization and survived it and succeeded eventually. That's really, you think about that and how hard that might have been. So it gives you a little perspective on your own life when you sort that stuff out. And I don't know why his close people and people representing his teachings don't talk more about that. Because to me, it's part of the lesson to be learned from people like him, is how hard it was and how challenging it was, and how much he really worried about money. Through it all, you see it in his letters right up till the last year of his life, worrying about his legacy and whether the organization will have enough to survive and all that. Anyway, this is some of the headlines that you had to deal with. There were scandals and rumors and people spreading what probably were lies about him and the people around him, the other swamis. This was what he called his Miami crucifixion. Now, mind you, Miami in 1927, 28, this is the Deep South. It was a dark-skinned guy teaching a heathen religion, which is how they would think of it, to mostly women.
That's interesting.
Didn't go over big with the male population. Some things don't change that much. Nuances do, but he essentially had to leave because there were threats to his life and so forth. This whole story is a complicated saga and worth reading about, but that's what happens. And then, another lawsuit that came at the end of the 30s. But there were also the joys of life, and in the middle of the 30s, he went back to India and spent a year with 4 months in traveling through Europe on the way, doing sightseeing and teaching. And here he is visiting Gandhi in 1935. He writes about that. There's a chapter about his being with Gandhi in Autobiography of a Yogi. And I found more information from other sources about what they spoke about. Similarly, when he visits Ramana Maharshi on that same visit, one of Ramana Maharshi's devotees took notes, and it turned out to be, an account of the conversation in another book that so you'll find stuff like that in my book. That's not in the Yogananda literature. Here he is with his guru, Sri Yukteswar, who dies while Yogananda's there, and Sri Yukteswar's passing becomes a big part of that year in India. And very moving. Also, seeing his father for what turned out to be the last time. He was a very emotional guy. Gurus are supposed to be, beyond all that stuff, but they have feelings and emotions too. They have joys, they have sorrows, and to his credit, he was much more open about such things than many swamis and spiritual teachers are. And you can see it in his letters and his poems and his songs and all that. He was a deeply feeling guy, and so the attachment to his family, missing India, wanting to go back, and all that was very moving. And when he came back to the U.S., famously, as you probably know, his wealthy disciple gave him this land down in Encinitas. How many have been to the property in Encinitas? Very worthwhile. I always say that Yogananda had the best real estate karma of all the gurus who came here. And I've studied all the gurus. I mean, the properties, just in Southern California alone, I mean, if you were a developer, you would kill for these properties. The Lake Shrine, Mount Washington, Cliffside property in Encinitas, they're all beautiful, all beautifully located. I always said his mantra was location, location. and even the places in India are beautifully landscaped and beautifully located. It's really something. Anyway, this was the temple that was built on the land that is no more, because in the late 40s it slid down the cliff and disappeared. But the pool, unused, is still there. It's very worth visiting. This is him in his quarters in Encinitas, working on his writing. When he came back from India, and by the way, I should say that his life, from the time he hits the road and ends up in LA and gets settled in LA, for the next 10 years, he's on the road most of the time. He was an itinerant yogi on trains, Minneapolis. I traced, I got, where he was when, and it was constant travel. And then he'd come back to LA for a while and then hit the road again, teaching in, Minneapolis and Denver and Pittsburgh and Buffalo and, all these places. And then eventually started training people to carry on in those places in his absence. When he comes back from India, and this is very common with the gurus and worth noting for yoga studies people, they seem to have a period of like missionary work where they're traveling and being public figures and gathering students. And at a certain point, if they've succeeded and they've trained people and they have reliable devotees and resources, funding and all that, they often then settle down and write and look to building the future of their legacy. And that's what Yogananda did. He became very conscious in the late 30s, especially into the 40s, of having limited time. He somehow knew intuitively he was not to live a long life. He worked really hard, and he knew that his legacy in the future, after his passing, would depend on his turning out a lot of written material, fine-tuning the teaching materials so they would endure, and cultivating the devotees, the disciples, cultivating their consciousness, training them properly so they could carry on after him. And that became his focus the last 10 or 12 years of his life. And he rarely left Southern California. He'd be in Encinitas, LA, and he would teach on Sundays or whatever. But mostly he was writing and working with his close disciples. And here he is. He might be working on the autobiography of the yogi right there. And how that whole enterprise of writing that book and fine-tuning it, and getting it published and being rejected, and all I even have, one of the great things about doing research is you find these little things no one knew. I got his publishing contract. So if you want to know what the terms of that deal was for Autobiography of a Yogi, read my book. Or ask me privately. And then the contract for when SRF bought the rights back from the original publisher, what the terms of that contract were. It's all very interesting, especially if you're a professional writer who knows book contracts. Anyway, all that and how he managed the last years of his life were a fascinating part of the story. Here's the original publication, the original hardcover of Autobiography of the Yogi.
Is that the one you have?
Hmm?
Is that the one you have?
No. By the time I bought mine not bought, by the time I read mine in 1970, there were many other editions, and the familiar orange cover was, after SRF bought the rights back, there were subsequent editions and cover change and all that.
Is there still a handwritten?
This is 1946. So I would not have had that copy. What?
Is there still like a handwritten manuscript of Yogananda?
I've never heard of if it exists, it's not exhibited. And I suspect that if it existed, it would be iconic, and it would be like a thing. But maybe they're just preserving it somewhere. This is the opening of the lake shrine. How many have been to the lake shrine on Sunset? This is the opening in 1950. To me, the crown jewel of the properties. Now this is him the last day of his life.
Wow.
Now, I have to say that as a writer, as a storyteller, writing about his last days was probably the most satisfying part of writing the book, and writing about the last day was fascinating, and it's very moving, and I won't go into details, but this is at the Biltmore Hotel, which is where he stayed when he first arrived. He always said he would die with India on his lips, and he did. The occasion was he had been dropping hints that he didn't have much time left. He was ill a lot the last few years, but working very hard. And there was a dinner. He lived long enough to see India gain its independence, which meant a lot to him. And this was a visit by the ambassador, the first ambassador of India, of free India to America. He visited LA with his wife, and Yogananda was to give a keynote address at a banquet for the Indian ambassador. And in that keynote, he talked about India and his love for India, and he read a stanza from his own poem about India called My India. And as soon as it came to the end, he dropped dead at the podium. And that was the end. And this was taken that night. It's called, it always became known as The Last Smile. It's the last picture taken of him. And it's on my book. So that's the overview of his life. I was going to say more about, the adaptation of his teachers, but I kind of did in the context of the talk. So let's open it up. Yeah.
How old was he when he passed?
How old was he? 59.
Oh,
So,
that's
pretty young.
yeah.
Even in those days. This is 1952, and he's 59 years old. Yeah.
What did he study in college?
Not much. He was a bad student. Like a lot of other geniuses, he was bored by school, by academic work, just wanted to be with his guru, study the teachings, meditate. He had no real interest in academic work. But he did it and managed through some interesting tales to pass his exams and all that.
So he studied sort of liberal or?
Yeah, whatever the general college, yeah, I don't even, was there majors? It didn't even come up. It was not hard. He didn't care very much. But he was very interested, when he started the schools, he was very interested in education and in proper education or traditional yogic methods of study. And so he started an alternative, what we would think of as an alternative school to, teach students in a very different way from the way he was taught. And so he cared about schooling and the training of the mind and the training of young people. And they started school that way, but he himself had no interest. I'm ignoring Eden to see if any of the students have questions. Eden?
What was one story that you didn't put in the book? Like that you were like, oh,
What did I
gonna
leave out?
Yeah.
Good question.
That's a good question. Did I leave? Anything I left out was just deemed superfluous or not interesting. And I could have written 600 pages. But, and there was a lot of cutting at the end. But, we kept in anything that we thought was, juicy and revealing and, interesting. And there's a lot of interesting stories. Some of them are just fun, fun little details that you learn. And I tried to fill in a lot of the cultural and historical context of his life, which I think is important. And so some of that, like immigration laws. And one thing I want to say, especially the day after this election, one of the things I came to really appreciate about him was he was single-minded about his mission. He was here to uplift consciousness and be a spiritual teacher and to bring out apply these yogic teachings to American life. But he was very engaged in the world, and he was very aware of current events and what was going on. And he spoke out, and he spoke against racism, against greed, and against the immigration limitations, and for Gandhi and the Indian independence movement. He cared, he was engaged, and he used his platform to speak out on issues of the day. And he was not disengaged yogi from the world. And that was, to me, very instructive. And it was also, on his part, rather courageous, because one of the things you'll learn is that the Brits were spying on him and the other Indians here. But, they were trying to stifle the independence movement. And here was a prominent Indian speaking out in favor of Gandhi. They were spying on him. They were opening his mail. They were, I found, correspondence from one British consulate to another. I went to, it seems okay, but let's keep our eye on him, you know. So. And so he could have been deported at any time as a subversive.
Yeah,
But,
this wasn't a citizen, yeah.
so it was, yes.
So I'm sure you've heard the story where they asked him if he was an avatar, and he said, you know, well.
Tell us.
I'm sure you've heard the story where, you know, they asked Yogananda if he was an avatar or not, and he said, well, you know, it would take one to do this kind of work. And I just wondered if you had anything to comment on that.
There are people who think Yogananda was an avatar, an incarnation of God. There are people who think he was just a great Sadguru, a great yogi. There are people who think he was a fraud. I am not in the position, I know he was not a fraud, but I am not in the position of knowing whether who's an avatar, who's enlightened. I don't care. I was telling the human story. That's not, it's beyond my pay grade. And frankly, I think it's beyond everybody's pay grade. People who say, oh, Yogananda was an avatar, I just know it. You know it? You must be an avatar. How do you know these things? I'll tell you one thing. He was human enough to have problems and deal with hassles and be upset and be angry and be worried and to have fun and to enjoy himself and to love people and be wise and be a guide. And he changed. When you see the story of a human being, you see growth and maturation. He was not the same person at 59 as he was when he came here at 27. He had grown, he had learned, he had matured. And you could tell from his descriptions of his own spiritual experiences, there were breakthroughs along the way. His state of consciousness was not the same when he was 30 as when he was 50. He describes those experiences. So to me, there's evolution of consciousness and growth as a human being. Whether an avatar would have those, I don't know. To me, it doesn't matter. What matters is what he taught.
Yeah, the humanism just, you know, comes through so powerfully in his autobiography, and it sounds like your book as well. My question is, since you know in such detail all the challenges that he faced during his time, and as you started to tell us this, you know, you really get a whole different perspective on American history as well. What do you think it would have been if his trajectory, if he had been one of the gurus starting in the 60s or later?
Yeah,
Because it would have been a very
different time,
thing.
different period. I mean, I wrote about in American Veda, I write about all the gurus from the 60s and 70s. It was a totally different time. I mean, I was there, you know, and being a young person in 1968 or 70 was very different from 1928 or 30. Vastly different time period. So,
What about his predisposition? Do you think it would
what
have
he
fit
would
in
have
that
been
time?
like,
Yeah.
it would have been a different
Yeah.
world. He would have adapted in
Uh-huh.
a different way. You know, he started in the 20s when he realized, you know, he could not do things in the traditional Indian way of instructing every individual privately, guru to student. He created a correspondence course. This was high technology at the time. This was a big deal. You clipped a coupon and you mailed it and you got something in return, a hat or a toaster or lessons from a guru. And you know, people criticized him. Oh, you can't put these things in writing. You can't do this. It has to be a transmission. He said, well, no, some of it I'll have to do this way and I'll reserve some of it that must be taught by direct transmission. It was an adaptation for which he took criticism. The gurus in the 60s and 70s did the same thing, only it was videotape.
And
Now it would be an app.
well,
Right.
an app or online conference. Would he
Yeah.
survive all of the
So, you know,
controversies? Do you think?
So he would have adapted in a different way. But the teachings would have been the same, and the core message would have been the same and unchanged, as it remains to this day. They're coming out with a new set of the SRF lessons soon. And they've been discussing for years whether they should, instead of mailing them out, allow people to download them as, Yeah.
Did you work with SRF
Yeah.
in making this book?
It was a symbiotic relationship. And I should say, I never became a disciple.
Right.
I never became a formal student of Yogananda's. I had my own path. And in the end, that served me well. He was one of many teachers I learned from. But I was able to write a biography as an objective outsider. And my relationship with SRF remains very cordial. They cooperated with me. I could not have found some of the material I used without them. I would have made more mistakes if they weren't around to correct me and give me materials I wouldn't have had. But at the same time, it was my book, and final copy is mine. But it was a cooperative relationship. You want to answer?
At the end of the autobiography, they talk about how his body had kind of remained natural, in a natural state.
I thought I might get through this evening without now that question coming up. So did you hear the question? You've all read Autobiography of a Yogi. You've all seen that black bordered page where it says that his body was uncorrupted a few weeks after his death. Well, there are conflicting stories with that. People have said, and so there have been coroners and other experts who have said it's not that uncommon. The rest of the letter points out that there was some discoloring of the nose after 2 or 3 weeks. That was the beginning of decomposition. His body had been encased in glass and had been embalmed. Given that, people have said it's not that unusual. Yet they still make a point of it. So I don't know the reality. I did see the death. I have a copy of the death certificate, so I know he was embalmed. If you were to go to Forest Lawn and disinter the body and see it had not changed since 1952, that would be pretty cool. Or if you found it had like any other body, would it make a difference? I ask you, would it matter one way or the other? To me, the teachings would be the same, his life would have been the same. That's what matters. And I've never understood why people make a big deal of whether his body decomposed or not. It's, to me, irrelevant. I'm perfectly willing to say great yogis, their bodies change and, things there may be things that happen to yogis' bodies that would not happen to the rest of us. But what does that have to do with being happy or being fulfilled or achieving higher states of consciousness? To me, nothing. So that's my take. Yeah.
He's 59. What was the cause of death?
Heart attack. He had issues. And I speculate a little bit in the book about what might have been going on, but he was not well a lot of the time the last few years.
Oh, I started to inquire about the Kriya Yoga when I was living close to the SRF on Sunset, and I never delved into it. I just started taking yoga classes around town. Now I know about all the hatha, the ashtanga, hot yoga, cold yoga. So can you tell us a little bit about the Kriya Yoga?
About
Yogananda's little, I mean, I got a couple little printouts of it, but
my recommendation truly, given the lack of time now, because we have to wind up, but even just, even if we had more time, I would say look into it through
them.
or, through a proper lineage
Okay.
that represents Yogananda. I obviously, writing a biography, I have to talk about what he taught and define Kriya Yoga as he taught it and some of the methods and all that. But it's
Go
hard to
direct, yeah.
summarize.
Okay.
And you can learn more just, with a 20-minute Google search than I could tell you now.
Okay.
Should we wrap it up?
Yeah, thank you, Phil.
Thank you. Books for sale at the LMU discount. My mailing list, if you'd like